bracket, and I couldn't figure out how to get out of that. And so what that means is that I'm on my iPad, and I'm going to read from my computer, but what that means is I can't share the screen with a PowerPoint. So you don't get a PowerPoint, you just get me, and I've wasted enough time, so let me go. I don't have a great deal of time in what follows to give you, to rehearse the plot of the novel I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to take my abstract as read and perhaps send you back to that if you need to be reminded about what I'm talking about. And I'm sorry I missed my introduction, so I don't know how much you've said. So what I'm going to do in a few minutes that remain is to offer a brief set of reflections on some questions raised by a project that I'm beginning to prepare a new critical edition of Olive Schreiner's novel, The Story of an African Farm, which was published in 1883 by Chapman and Hall in London for Edinburgh University Press. This is an important novel regarded as sort of seminal Anglophone South African novel, and I can say more about that in questions if necessary. I'm interested, in part as an editor beginning this process, in what the reading life of a young woman with no formal education in a series of remote settlements in the northeastern interior of the Cape Colony from the 1850s, in the 1850s and 60s, might tell us about networks of reception, intellectual labor, and imaginings of the sublime, perhaps of utopia too, and also in the implications for understanding the challenges facing a modern editor, challenges that might be formulated thus: how do readings of a text or a version of a text, as well as those behind a text, activate potentiality in relation to contexts to come? And that might be a link amongst our three papers. Schreiner's novel is a generic hybrid, at least in equal parts, as Jed Esty has observed, South African farm novel, New Woman fiction, Dickensian farce, naturalist tragedy, colonial gothic, Victorian melodrama, allegorical tale, spiritual autobiography, and neo-transcendentalist novel of ideas. To what extent, scholars ask, was Schreiner self-consciously producing something new? Was this hybridity a result of her eclectic reading? These might be the same question, or the second perhaps an answer to the first. African Farm certainly testifies to the extraordinary range of reading undertaken by its unusual young author, though it's difficult to ascertain whether or not Schreiner's reading was unusual in its time or place. By the time she was born at the Wittebergen mission station on the eastern fringes of the Cape Colony, the borders of what is now Lesotho, on 24 March 1855, her parents, London-born Rebecca and Swabian-born Gottlob, had been in the field for more than 17 years. Olive would follow her parents to a further posting before her father's dismissal and the family's dispersal. So he was accused of trading, which he couldn't do as a missionary, and was dismissed from his post. After a peripatetic childhood as ward or guest of family and friends, she found herself governess on 3 farms in the Cradock district, where between 1875 and 79, she wrote The Story of an African Farm. And I'll just say briefly that I've done a lot of work on the publication history and the early reception history and published on that, and that's not really what I'm talking about today. So this is much more gestural and tentative. The Bible was the dominant literary influence on her childhood, and next to it, her very best biographer, Karel Skuman, observes probably Charles Wesley's hymns. Novels were not in favor amongst the older and more doctrinaire Shriners, though some fiction did feature in Olive's childhood. She mentions late in life reading Robinson Crusoe, aged 9. The only book we know she owned as a child was Mrs. Cameron's Memoir of Emma and Her Nurse, or The History of Lady Harwood, 1820. What reading matter was available in small Eastern Cape towns in the period? Balfour had a weekly magazine that reprinted material from Cape Town quarterlies, and the Illustrated London News was widely available. The subscription library in Cradock, to which Schreiner may have had access between 1868 and 1870, had, by 1867, 737 volumes, 7 newspaper and 8 periodical subscriptions. The only book we know Schreiner read during this period, by her own admission before she was 14, was George Bancroft's multi-volume History of the United States. And the American connection is an interesting one to which I'll return shortly. In her middle teens, Schreiner discovered the writers who would be most influential for her idiosyncratic worldview. In 1870, Herbert Spencer's First Principles, gifted by a magistrate's clerk known to the family. In 1871-72, Mill's Principles of Political Economy and books on ancient Rome in the library of a family friend who employed her as a governess. And in 1873, Darwin's Descent of Man, which she read while on the diamond fields, the new diamond fields at Kimberley. Apart from political economy and natural history, we know that while drafting African Farm, Schreiner read Shelley, Ruskin, and Emerson, and in 1876-8, Shakespeare, Goethe, Macaulay, and Gibbon. The rural eastern districts of the Cape were comparatively much less settled, much less sophisticated than the Australian colonies in the same period, though I think it's fair to say Schreiner's example suggests also a much more sophisticated reading than many contemporary South Africans would think of these, in still many ways, marginal parts of the country, in that of the colony in that moment. Schreiner was reading widely and forming attachments that would last the rest of her life, frequently describing for her new friends in London in the 1880s, like Havelock Ellis and Carl Pearson, how her early reading mitigated feelings of suffocation and loneliness. Her claims about who continued to move her shifted with the occasion and correspondent, but the most frequently cited include Heine, Shelley, Browning, later Whitman, and regularly Emerson. The character in African Farm is called Waldo, and the pseudonym under which the novel appeared was Ralph or Rafe Iron. And here I would have shown you the lovely bound 2-volume first edition. Schreiner would write to Havelock Ellis in 1884 that Emerson's work was, quote, just like a Bible to me. It comforts me so. We know Schreiner bought a copy of Emerson's essays, likely from 1841, on a short trip to Cape Town in late 1873, although the only copy that she left on her death was from 1888. At that time, she was particularly miserable, Ellis wrote about Olive, and here's a quote from Havelock Ellis. She remembers sitting at the window and the delight it gave her, especially self-reliance. She would like that volume buried with her. It was the expression of her highest self. She clings, turns to him in desperation, and he seems to take her into a larger atmosphere. This is indeed precisely what Schreiner appears to have taken from Emerson, admiring him as a thinker who spurred other thinking or new arrangements of thought, rather than being himself truly original. She continued to turn to Emerson to remind herself how to turn the loneliness she remembered from the Karoo area of the interior of the Cape Colony, where she spent most of her life, outside when she was in South Africa, into a state of receptivity and productivity. Schreiner might perhaps have said, using a contemporary vocabulary, that in Emerson's curatorial and facilitating imagination, she found a mirror and lens, as well as a fellow traveler, and her books, like his, would travel too. Simon Lewis has argued that African Farm's representation of nature is Emersonian in its use of the idea of analogy. Think, if you know the novel, of a passage in Times and Seasons in which the oddly plural narrator finds a gander drowned in a dam and examines its organs, seeing their singular beauty echoed in the surrounding thorn trees. That might be the only gesture to the sublime that has survived in the severe cut I've done to this paper, but I'm hoping that they are enough for us to make connections. Schreiner's rejection of institutionalized religion and modeling of an alternative apprehension of divinity in universal awareness that required natural observation had become widely known through the colonies after his visit to England in 1847. Rebecca, Olive's mother, had read Emerson's essays in 1860 when Olive was a child. Schreiner's attraction to Emerson also speaks to a movement at the Cape amongst liberal ministers in several denominations for church reform and amongst scientists and intellectuals towards agnosticism or atheism. Lewis suggests too that there are links to be followed between Emerson's attraction to Rammohn Roy's Hindu reformism in early 19th century Bengal, a very important figure for Emerson and in Emerson's sense of Unitarianism. We don't have time to follow this lead, but my point here is to emphasize the complex networks of influence and affiliation that open up when we think about how reading connects anti-establishment thinkers across oceans, race, or ethnic borders, establishes what Alec Obama describes as cross-national readings of anti-colonial interdiscursivity. We certainly need more of this kind of connecting, speaking as a scholar of a national literature that is barely or only even problematically that national, and which is also notoriously exceptionalist. Such work would avoid the kinds of misreadings that I think are perpetrated when one reads instrumentally for texts fit with predetermined conceptual frames, as for example in Zarina Aslami's The Dream Life of Citizens, late-Victorian novels and the Fantasy of the State, published in 2012, which begins, in fact, with Olive Schreiner's Story of an African Farm, and treats it as a case study for what Aslami considers a critique of a mode of liberal governance reliant on and generative of what she calls fantasies of wholeness and recognition that it inspires in colonial subjects. Schreiner's novel, she says, dismisses the organic concept sacred to 19th century political and social theory, missing entirely, I think, that in fragments there are also a sense of universal presence that is able to unify them, which is, of course, a transcendentalist idea. Aslami's book shows how limiting it can be to focus entirely on the British imperial context and read allegorically with that frame in mind, rather than thinking metonymically, perhaps, about other links and affiliations, conversations and connections. Okay, I'm sorry, that was a bit scattershot. I teased you earlier, and also in my abstract, with a promise to pose some broader questions about methodology, and this might be, in fact, where we are able to make links amongst the papers, if that's something that a fellow panelist wanted to do. So let me conclude by giving you a sense of what, given more time, I might have tried to unpack. This would be to pose a challenge about what I'd like to call the ontology of text, rather than from the perspective of specifically of textual or editorial scholarship, but one that wonders about how later contexts, so this is to shift from the pre-reading to later contexts, activate potentiality within a text. How does the editor interested in the later reader, with the knowledge of contexts that come after, account for the ways in which these events change how we read the original text? How does the editor anticipate future such events and readers? And I'm sorry, I missed Lucy's answer to my question. So it might be that this is a kind of question that would be, could be posed to someone who chose to edit Julius Vogel's novel now. Here, if you knew about it, you'd hear the influence of other of my scholarly work, not on the 19th century, not as a textual editor, but on how post-apartheid texts, in a moment of profound post-apartheid disappointment, recuperate the potential of the hopefulness that preceded the transition, or that attended the birth of the new nation and structured its early years. How might thinking about affect and temporality be brought usefully into conversation with print culture's scholarship? In The Principle of Hope, in relation to the utopian potential of literary work, Ernst Bloch suggested that, and this is a quotation, I'll read it slowly because it's not on the screen for you, I'm sorry. Every great work of art above and beyond its manifest content is carried out according to a latency of the page to come, or in other words, in the light of the content of a future which has not yet come into being, and indeed of some ultimate resolution as yet unknown. The critic Russell Samolsky put Bloch to work in a fascinating 2011 monograph called Apocalyptic Futures, in which he thinks about how texts like Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Kafka's Story in the Penal Colony, J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians, cannot be read in the same way after events that followed their publication. Specifically, he has in mind the Rwandan genocide for Conrad, the Holocaust for Kafka, and the kind of late apartheid emergency for Coetzee. Events, however, that seem proleptically imagined as possibilities in the world in which the text knows it will exist, in Samolsky's thinking. He calls this these texts
2 minutes left, sorry, Andrew, 2 minutes.
Sure, I'm nearly at the end. He called these texts apocalyptic powers and argues that his intention is less to situate these works within their historical contexts then to examine the way in which these texts summon their specific future contexts. These apocalyptic works are never simply past, he writes, but rather release energies that both condition and are conditioned by future contexts. Literature frames what does or does not come to be seen and said. And this is the very final paragraph. In relation to Schreiner, it's difficult for a South African-born academic not to think about the ways in which the apocalypse of apartheid to come is proleptically imagined everywhere in a late colonial novel like Schreiner's. But this is perhaps too easy. I think the text has a sense of much more simply than the spectacle of racism, but of varieties of affective responses to scenes of structural inequality. And I'm going to have to think during the editorial work to come about how to account for the novel's many instances of what I called earlier cross-national interdiscursivity. And I'll leave it there. Sorry about my catastrophic Zoom skills.
Oh, that was just absolutely fantastic. I really, really enjoyed that paper. And all three papers in this session, you're right, have really spoken to each other in these interesting ways. And I'm really thinking now about this idea of, you know, texts of the future are also texts for future readers. And I think that that's something really interesting for us to navigate. And so, yeah, I was wondering on that. And I know that you said very clearly that you've done work on the reception of Olive Schreiner and this text elsewhere, but could you just give us perhaps a little snapshot of how that might connect to this work that you've just given us now about that, you know, that reception question around those future readers of this text?
Sure. I mean, so I'll say that I feel kind of split in this moment because I feel like I've become a scholar of post-apartheid literature, affect and temporality, whereas my first instantiation as a doctoral student at Oxford and then as an early career scholar was as a kind of book history person. And I did a book in 2007, which was the first kind of book history engagement with the construction of the idea of a South African literature in English through a series of case studies of the publication and reception histories of a number of books, starting with Olive Schreiner's Story of an African Farm, 1883, which was a hugely important novel of the New Woman, published in London 2 years after Schreiner had arrived as a young woman, hoping to study medicine, and you know, the rest of her life is a series of minor disasters and disappointments. She goes backwards and forwards to South Africa. She becomes an opponent of Cecil Rhodes. She becomes a great friend of Eleanor Marx, Karl Marx's daughter, Havelock Ellis, the sexologist, and so on. So she moves in really fascinating circles. The novel's published in 2 volumes in January of 1883 by Chapman and Hall after being rejected by a number of publishers, and some of the work that I did was to uncover the reader reports. For example, Macmillan rejected her. George Meredith read for Macmillan. And they're really interesting, in fact, to look at those report books and think about how she's being read alongside manuscripts that get rejected from Australia, for example. So there's a sense of you know, the lenses with which people like Meredith are reading texts by women and texts by colonials in the same kind of you know, with the same kind of lenses. Sorry, this is a long answer to your question, but you know, it's an instant you know, success. It's published under a male pseudonym, but it becomes pretty clearly and widely known who it's by, although the pseudonym stays on the book for a while. So there's a second, the first 2-volume edition sells for, I think, 21 shillings, the second one for 5 shillings, and then they're cheaper editions and also colonial editions later. But what was really interesting to trace was the way in which multiple communities of readers take up the novel in different ways. It becomes really important for early well, not, I won't say anti-colonial, but kind of early Black nationalist readers in South Africa in the 1920s. Someone like Sol Plaatje, who publishes the first novel in English by a Black South African writer, calls his daughter Olive. It becomes hugely important for early kind of proto-feminist suffragette circles in South Africa and in the UK. it's pirated in the States and becomes important for all sorts of proto-feminist circles in the States. And if I'm answering your question, but you know, one of the interesting things that I did there was to try and trace the afterlives, and it also, you know, becomes a crucial book for all you know, left writers in the Anglophone tradition in South Africa. So, you know, without Schreiner, there would be no Nadine Gorham as the conservationist. There would be no J.M. Coetzee in the heart of the country. So there's a clear line of connection.
And going on from this point, oh, we've got a question from Paul Egger, who asks, "Why does the reception tell its own story?" He says probably only an open-ended commentary will account for it. A digital form of the edition might allow for future collaborative commentary, or do you see some other possible methodology?
Yeah, that's a nice point. I think Paul may have heard a version of this paper in 2017, which will tell you how much progress I've made on the edition. But I really am hoping to get it properly underway very soon. And Paul made some wonderful suggestions to me then, which I'm still thinking about. I really like the idea of a future digital edition, which you know, could be collaborative, and in some ways that's an idea that might be taken up with an institution like Amazwi, which used to be the National English Literary Museum in what used to be Grahamstown. It's now Amazwi in Makhanda in the Eastern Cape, which is, you know, very close to where Schreiner worked and wrote the early drafts of Story of an African Farm. There's a way in which that kind of project, you know, could really open to the impulses of decolonial, you know, decolonial scholarship and decolonial practice in the archive and in the field of book history, which is something that I think we need to think about. And, you know, we haven't necessarily, I haven't engaged in that conversation as much as I intend to. But, you know, as Paul and every other editor knows, an edition is produced, you know, for a particular publisher who gives you certain constraints. And so the next couple of years are going to be an interesting, you know, process of negotiating within those constraints to see how much of a sense I can give in, you know, preparing a manageable apparatus and a manageable set of annotations of the importance of thinking theoretically about these kinds of readers to come.
That's